Racist cop detains black CIA agent and humiliates himself upon discovering his identity. If you're new to this channel, I invite you to click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any amazing new stories here. Expensive cars drove through the streets from time to time. The houses had high walls and showed the wealth and security that their owners loved so much. The normal calm of the place, however, would be cut short quickly and intensely. Michael, an experienced policeman, was on patrol with the same serious look as always. He had some features that showed how many years he had worked. His face had deep wrinkles. His gaze was suspicious. He always kept his hand near his belt as if he were ready to act. He knew that neighborhood very well. He knew that anything or anyone that didn't look normal needed more attention. He saw Thomas. Thomas was a man standing on the corner. He was paying attention to what was going on around him. Thomas was wearing a dark plain coat. He looked at the small number of people in the street with a calm that was different from the movement of the city. What Michael didn't know and couldn't think about was that this man wasn't just an ordinary suspect. Thomas worked as a CIA agent. He was on a secret mission. Thomas was a strong black man. He had a serious, thoughtful look on his face. He was there doing his job. He was paying attention to what was happening in a very important case. To Michael, who was used to early judgments and fixed ideas about people because of the color of their skin, this man seemed like a stranger. He thought the man was a threat in a place where, in his view, he shouldn't be. Michael stopped the police car next to Thomas. Without a second thought, he got out with the confidence of someone who thought the place was his, or at least that's what he thought. He walked with firm steps. His uniform was very tidy, shining in the light of the street lamps. With a voice full of risky things, he said, "What are you doing here? Looking for something you shouldn't be? Wanting to take something from someone or sell something?" The question wasn't just a way to start a conversation. It was an attack, a question that was actually an accusation. Michael's voice, full of contempt, clearly showed what he was thinking. In that wealthy neighborhood, in the streets he thought were safe, a man like Thomas was something strange. He thought it strange that someone who didn't wear an expensive suit or drive a luxury car could be there for real reasons. Thomas was surprised at the unfair way he had been treated. He was very angry. He had experienced similar things before in other places. He knew that having black skin in some places was like having a target on your back. But in that instant, something in Thomas broke. He wasn't ready to take another insult in disguise. He wouldn't accept another accusation without proof. He also wouldn't want to see yet another proof of power that was based on old, wrong ideas. His muscles tensed and the silence between the two men became too much to bear. "What do you think I'm doing here?" replied Thomas, his voice full of tension, like a spring about to burst. The fight was present in the room. The tension was clear. Michael, with his hands on his hips and his chest puffed out, took a step backwards but continued to look smug. He didn't know the mistake he was about to make. He also didn't imagine the bad consequences that his words and actions could cause. For him, this was just another night on the job. It was just another suspect to take out of the area. For Thomas, it was like reliving an injustice that happened before. It was an attempt to make him less human, to turn him into a stereotype. He didn't want to accept it anymore. Thomas broke the silence by closing his hand into a fist. It seemed to hold all the sadness and injustice he had experienced. Inside him, a rage was rising and he stopped for a moment. He knew he was in a difficult situation, but the name-calling, the accusations, and the unfair treatment, it all came together and he couldn't take it anymore. And that's how he took action. Thomas was very angry and his pride was hurt. He could no longer hold back the anger that was building up inside him. This was not the first attack he had faced in his life. He had already experienced many microaggressions. He felt people's suspicious glances. People's words were full of prejudice. He had been judged many times, even without having the chance to defend himself. But that night, at that moment, the line had been crossed. He was a CIA agent with training. He took care of secret activities and protected the country. However, in one neighborhood, people saw him as a normal criminal. This was because the color of his skin seemed different from that of the people who lived there. Michael, for his part, didn't know what was going to happen next. His arrogant and contemptuous attitude showed that he had spent years getting the wrong idea about power. He thought his clothes and badge gave him that power. He wasn't ready for what would happen next. When Michael saw Thomas's watchful gaze and how he moved, he took a step back. But it wasn't fast enough. Thomas moved quickly forward. His hand hit Michael's chest with such force that it surprised the policeman. The impact was hard and fast, full of all the anger and sadness that Thomas had been harboring. Michael took a step back, surprised, and his heart was beating fast. He felt the air rushing out of his lungs as he tried to understand what had just happened. He wasn't used to being challenged like this. This was all the more surprising because it had been done by someone he had judged without thinking straight. For a short moment, Michael stopped. The pain was coming from his chest, but soon his cop skills came to the fore. His years of learning were put into practice. He couldn't let that man, no matter who he was, embarrass him like that, especially in front of other people. With an angry face, Michael replied. He lunged at Thomas. He wanted to grab Thomas with the strength of a man who always solved things by shouting and fighting. The two bodies slammed into each other, and the fight really started. This was no ordinary conversation. It was a fight between two men with their own histories. Michael believed too much in the authority and power he thought he had. Thomas, on the other hand, was very angry about the years of injustice he had suffered. The punches were swift and without pity. Thomas, with the quick reflexes of a trained agent, dodged Michael's punches with surprising skill. Every movement of his body was precise and well thought out. When his hands hit the target, they sounded like the strike of a strong, controlled hammer. Michael, for his part, was desperate. He tried to control the situation, but soon saw that he was up against someone who was much better prepared than he was. The fight escalated. They both scrambled across the floor. Their bodies hit the hard asphalt of the street. Low shouts could be heard all around. The few people passing by moved away in fear. The sound of blows and bodies hitting each other could be heard in the quiet night. It disturbed the peace of the neighborhood. Sweat poured down the faces of the two men. They were breathing heavily and quickly. It was then that fate took a severe turn. In the middle of the confusion, a surprise person appeared. A pregnant woman was walking through the place. She seemed distracted and didn't notice the fight going on near her. She was just passing by on her way home from the doctor's and didn't see the danger coming. During the fight, Thomas accidentally pushed Michael too hard, and the policeman fell. He took steps backwards, waving his arms in the air as he tried to regain his balance. But instead of stopping, Michael hit the pregnant woman directly. The impact caused great damage. The woman fell to the ground. Her weak body hit the concrete sidewalk. She let out a loud scream. The situation had changed a lot. The fight between Thomas and Michael ceased to be important at that moment. It was because something very serious had happened. The two men stopped, breathless, eyes wide, staring at the woman on the ground. They couldn't believe what they had done. Blood stained the woman's dress. The harsh sound of her breathing broke the silence that followed the blow. The world seemed to stand still for an instant. The streetlights shone in an unusual way, illuminating the frightening scene that was taking place in front of everyone. Michael, still confused by Thomas's punch and the violence of the situation, felt the weight of what he had just done come upon him like a great burden. His heart beat fast with fear and guilt. He was trying very hard to understand what had happened. Thomas felt a strong sense of fear and helplessness overwhelm his body. He had lost control of the situation. Now an innocent life was in danger. His eyes, which had once glowed with anger, now showed great concern and despair. The woman's dress, which was a simple, light-colored garment, began to be stained a strong, frightening red. This contrasted with the dim glow of the surrounding streetlights. Her belly, which had once been clearly full and round, now looked like a weak promise that could be undone at any moment. The expression of pain on her face showed how serious the situation was. One of her hands, shaking, tried to protect the baby she was holding. Thomas was the first to act. He broke the silence that was keeping him still. He went over to the woman. His heart was beating too fast. Thoughts were jumbled in his head. What have I done? That was all that was going through my head. The pain in his eyes was visible as he knelt beside her. His hands were shaking as he tried to find a way to help. He was a trained professional who was used to facing difficult situations, but nothing had prepared him for this. Guilt, very strong, began to settle in his heart. "Calm down," he said softly, but his words seemed weak and lacked force, as if he wasn't sure what he was saying. "Help is coming. Please stay calm." The woman's face was tight with pain. Her eyes were half open and tears were running slowly down her pale cheeks. Every time she managed to breathe, it felt like she was fighting death. A small spot of blood was beginning to appear around her body. Thomas held her hand, sensing the weakness and delicacy that came from the life that was slowly leaving her body. He saw Michael, who was still standing, his face as white as a ghost's. Michael, unlike Thomas, was trapped in a cycle of surprise and remorse. The hand that had hit him was now lying beside him, trembling, as if it had no strength left. He observed the situation in front of him. He felt the great weight of the consequences that he himself had helped to bring about. It all started with an idea, an accusation made without thinking. Now, a life, maybe two, was about to end. Michael wanted to run. He wanted to disappear, but the seriousness of what he had done made him stand still. He was stuck where his attitude and prejudice had taken him. The sirens came closer. The sound grew louder and filled the place, reminding him that time was running out. The world seemed to spin faster around them. Red and blue lights appeared on the corner. They illuminated the scene in a strange and frightening way. Ambulances and police cars arrived quickly. Their doors opened very quickly. The doctors and policemen quickly went to the woman on the ground. In the meantime, Thomas and Michael were pushed away without much gentleness. The paramedics, who work well and quietly, placed the woman on a rescue bed. They also checked that she had normal signs of life. The face of one of the doctors, serious because of his work, could hardly hide his concern. The woman was bleeding profusely and the baby was still at risk. The radio buzzed with calls for more medical help. The ambulance doors closed quickly. The woman was rushed to the nearest hospital. The damage had already been done. A life was in danger, and perhaps even more than that. A quick mistake, caused by pride, anger, and prejudice, had brought consequences that could not be changed. Thomas and Michael were in different cars. Each of them felt what had happened in the last hour in very different ways. Thomas was sitting in the back seat of the car. He was leaning against the frosted window. He was trying to grasp the enormity of what had happened. His head was spinning non-stop, remembering the quick images, the fight at the beginning, the woman with the falling belly and the blood. He knew the situation was complicated, but there was something much more important going on right now, a life, and maybe more. Guilt gnawed at his chest, even though he knew he hadn't intended to hurt anyone. The guilt came from a very deep place. He realized sadly that he had let his anger take over. On the other side, Michael was trying to stay calm. As the officers closed the door of the police car, he realized that he was caught between what he had done and the very real fear of what was going to happen. His mind, unlike Thomas's, was already beginning to think of a plan to defend himself. He was trying to find a way out of all the guilt he had. He knew that if he wasn't agile, his profession and perhaps his freedom were at risk. The words he would use at the police station would be crucial. At the police station, the atmosphere was tense. The corridors echoed with the sound of muffled conversations, ringing telephones, and the constant noise of papers being handled. It was a place steeped in bureaucracy and rules, where every detail could determine a person's fate. Michael, with his uniform still wrinkled from the fight, was the first to be interrogated. Sitting in the small interrogation room, with the cold white light from the ceiling illuminating his face, he began to tell his version of events. "I was doing my rounds as I always do," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I noticed this man, Thomas, acting suspiciously in an upscale neighborhood. He seemed to be watching the houses as if he was planning something." Michael chose his words carefully, constructing his story like a jigsaw puzzle, piece by piece, while the officers listened in silence, taking notes. Each sentence was deliberate, designed to paint an image of Thomas as a threat, an invader in that elite neighborhood. Michael continued, "I spoke to him in a polite way, as I do with anyone I suspect. I asked him what he was doing in that place. That's when he got angry and attacked me for no reason. I tried to protect myself, of course, but he was fast and knew how to fight." Michael stopped for a moment, pausing to make people curious. "In the mess, he pushed me hard and..." He kept his voice down, as if he was very sad about what he would say next. "The woman who was expecting a baby was hurt. I couldn't stop it. I was just trying to do my job." Listening to his own version, Michael almost believed what he was saying. He was distancing himself from what really happened. He was changing events to make himself feel safer. The truth was that he was just doing his duty. Thomas, who was supposed to protect, had become the aggressor. Michael understood that if he could make the authorities believe his story, he would have a chance of escaping more serious punishment, and he needed that chance. When Thomas's time came, he was taken to the same question room where Michael had been. He sat with his hands clasped on the table. The policeman, who was experienced and looked tired, started asking questions. We want to know what you have to say about what happened. Tell us what happened. I work for the CIA, said Thomas clearly and simply. I was on a secret mission in that area. Michael came at me roughly. He made accusations without any proof. He treated me like I was a thug from the start, and that made me angry. I lost control and I recognized that. We reacted physically. I never wanted to hurt anyone. It was a great disgrace. A woman who did nothing wrong got hurt, and I never wanted that to happen. The detective listened carefully. However, his face changed when Thomas said he was a CIA agent. The room was full of tension. Thomas understood that this news changed everything. His position was not that of an ordinary person, and this information was important to the case. The detective paused for a moment before moving on. So you work as a federal agent? Asked the detective, not quite believing it. Thomas agreed, and the detective leaned forward a little. He said it makes things more difficult. Outside, gossip began to circulate quickly around the police station. A CIA agent was taking part, and this was no simple matter. The deputy, who until that moment had seen the situation as a normal case of brawling, was now out of options. He knew that any mistake could make the situation worse, so he decided to take the case to a formal hearing. Michael was sitting in an empty police room. The sound of police footsteps in the background reminded him of the anxiety he was feeling. Fear overwhelmed him inside. It was no ordinary fear that made him tremble. It was a stronger fear that left him with no way out. This fear entered his thoughts and made his hands shake as he tried to think of how to save himself. He knew the hearing was going to happen. He had to tell his side of the story to a judge. Thomas, now with his new position on show, had the support of the CIA and their influence. Michael wasn't just afraid of the hearing. He was afraid of what would happen next. It was in that moment of fear that an idea began to form. If he couldn't beat Thomas by telling the truth, he needed to use the truth in a way that would benefit him. Michael saw that he needed someone who could speak up for him. He wanted someone who could change the situation at the hearing. He had already lied at the police station and changed events, but that wouldn't be enough to beat the word of a CIA agent. He needed something stronger. And it was at that moment that he thought of Anthony. Anthony was the key. Michael knew that Anthony had a history with Thomas. That connection was something that could be used. They had been friends when they were children, but over time their lives had taken different paths. Thomas's life improved and he gained the respect and fame that came with being a CIA agent. Anthony, on the other hand, was left behind. He had to struggle to live in a world that didn't give him many chances. Michael heard rumors about the end of this friendship. He also heard that Anthony was angry with Thomas. That was it. Michael felt a strong impulse when he realized that Anthony could be controlled. If I could get Anthony to say that Thomas was thinking of doing something wrong in the neighborhood that night, it would help to make things uncertain. Besides, Anthony had the right reason. Anger. The person feels anger at having been left by Thomas. She was left penniless while her old friend was doing well in life. Michael knew he could use this emotional wound to his advantage, but Anthony wouldn't do it for free. Michael knew enough about the world to know that betraying a childhood friend would not be a simple task, and that Anthony would need a considerable incentive. It was then that the idea of a bribe popped into his head. $200,090. Would that be enough to make Anthony think twice? Do you want to buy his loyalty, even if only for a while, so that you can speak out against Thomas at the hearing? Michael felt a strong emotion. He was making a plan, a way to protect himself. The adrenaline that had previously left him without action now drove him forward. He made calls to people he knew. They were men who did things wrong, who knew how to handle a lot of money without anyone noticing. The money was going to be passed carefully to Anthony, without leaving any signs. Michael was used to going through situations that were close to illegal. It wasn't the first time he'd mixed up with people who could help with dubious business deals. He also knew it wouldn't be the last time. When Michael spoke to Anthony, he was clear and objective. Anthony's voice on the phone was surprised and hesitant, but Michael knew how to guide the conversation. He touched Anthony's open wounds. He remembered how Thomas had abandoned him. Thomas did well in life, while Anthony had too many problems to make ends meet. Michael made him believe that telling him what he knew about Thomas wasn't just a chance to make money. It was also a way of taking revenge in silence on the man he thought was his brother, but who left him when he had succeeded in life. $290,000, Anthony, Michael said calmly. That's more than you'll earn in many years. All you have to do is attend the hearing and tell your story. Say that Thomas was there that night with plans to do something wrong. It's not a falsehood, it's just a way of telling the story we want everyone to believe. Anthony finally answered. He spoke in a low, doubtful voice. I'll do it. It was a weak answer, a whisper of agreement, but it was enough. The plan was being carried out. Michael hung up the phone and felt a quick sense of relief. But the fear was still there, lurking underneath. He understood that he couldn't trust Anthony completely. However, at that moment he had no other option. It was the only chance he had to escape the situation. On the day of the court hearing, the room where people listened to cases was full of low conversations. Everyone was waiting for the hearing to begin. Thomas, who worked for the CIA, was used to dealing with complicated and risky situations. However, that courtroom, with many people watching and judging, was a new situation for him. It was there that his dignity, his work, and his freedom were going to be tested. On the other side of the room, Michael was sitting next to his lawyer, but he didn't really feel safe. He knew the day wouldn't be easy. Thomas now had the support of the CIA. He was also afraid that the truth about the fight and the injured woman would come out. This fear was beginning to break down the calm he was trying to show. The judge entered the room and everyone stood as a sign of respect. When silence fell, the hearing began. The prosecution called its witnesses one by one. They told what had happened that night. They showed Thomas to be a dangerous man. They said he had lost control and got into a fight that ended in tragedy for his pregnant wife. But what really surprised Thomas was when the defense, defending Michael, called its last witness. The defense asks Anthony Santoro to speak, Michael's lawyer announced, his voice booming off the walls of the courtroom. The name rang in Thomas's head like thunder. He turned his gaze to the door. His heart leapt in his chest as he saw who was coming. Antonio, his longtime friend. The man he had known since he was a little boy had stayed with him through the most difficult times of his youth. Anthony's presence there seemed strange, like something from his past that shouldn't be there. Thomas thought for a moment about what he might be doing there. He could be a witness who would help the defense. This person would tell him something that would help solve his problem. The way Anthony looked away from Thomas showed something sad. Anthony was there to fool him. The judge asked everyone to remain silent. Anthony then went up to the place where the witnesses speak. The whole courtroom seemed to have stopped to watch what was happening in that scene. Anthony wondered for a moment before sitting down. He seemed anxious. His hands were shaking a little. His eyes looked around the room as if searching for a way out that wasn't visible. Michael's lawyer came closer and started asking questions. Mr. Santoro, you've known the accused Thomas for a long time, haven't you? Anthony agreed slowly. He spoke quietly and doubtfully as he answered. Yes, we met when we were children. Thomas felt a pain in his chest when he heard those words. The story they had been telling, the memories of a friendship that had changed them both, were now being altered to help a bad plan. The silence in the room was strong. Everyone was waiting to hear what would happen next. Were you in the area that night? Asked the lawyer, leading Anthony slowly into the trap he had helped to set. Anthony doubted it. He glanced briefly at Thomas but then looked away. He seemed ashamed of what he was about to say. Did you know you were passing a point of no return? Yes, I was close, said Anthony, his voice wavering. Michael's lawyer spoke again, this time more firmly. What did you realize that night? What can you say about how Thomas acts? There was a long pause. Anthony knew he was about to tell a lie. It made him feel bad. He didn't want to do it, but the money Michael offered was very tempting. With $290,000, he could finally abandon that life of failure. But at the same time, he was about to betray the man he once thought was his brother. The whole room seemed to stop breathing as they waited for his answer. Thomas, Anthony began, struggling to find the words. He was there. I saw him. He seemed to be thinking about something. Something negative. Thomas almost couldn't believe what he was hearing. His surprised face was not noticed by anyone in the room. Anthony, the man he trusted, was telling lies. And it wasn't a simple lie. It was a lie made with great care to finish him off. He seemed anxious and restless. I heard him talking on the phone. He was talking about a plan to take someone by force. Anthony hesitated when talking about money, but then went ahead. He said he didn't know how to act. I left, but I heard afterwards that he'd had a fight with Michael and then what happened. The room was completely silent. Anthony's lie hung in the air like bad smoke. Thomas stared at his old friend with surprise and sadness. He wanted to speak up. He wanted to complain about the betrayal, but the words were stuck in his throat. How could someone he knew so well turn against him like that? Thomas knew that the answer lay in the money. Michael had figured out how to use Anthony's resentment to turn against him. Now Thomas was facing the result of years of hurt that had never been resolved. The judge paused for a moment to understand what the witness was saying. Michael's lawyer smiled, happy with the effect Anthony's speech had had. At that moment, Michael's plan seemed to be working. Anthony's disloyal testimony had been just what he needed to make people doubt Thomas's innocence. But inside Thomas, something was beginning to change. The first fright was replaced by a calm, thoughtful resolve. He knew that Anthony had been controlled. Now, more than before, Thomas was determined to show the truth. The court had heard a lie, but he still had friends in the CIA. These friends were allies who would defend him and the truth. Michael's blow, although strong, would not be the end. Based on the testimony and evidence shown, this court finds Thomas guilty of assault, reckless behavior, and possibly participating in illegal activities, said the judge in a firm, unemotional voice. He went on to say that the tragedy of the pregnant woman showed what Thomas had done that night. Thomas listened, but every word seemed far away, as if he was being pulled out of his own life. The image of Anthony in the witness box, lying insecurely, was still clear in his memory. The way Anthony didn't look, and how he seemed to carry a burden on his back while telling lies, now stuck in Thomas's head like a sad song that wouldn't stop. Friendship, which had once been one of the few things holding her back in life, now became the reason for her downfall. The punishment was officially handed down, and the judge said, "Thomas will be imprisoned for 8 years." The court took into account the situations that helped lessen the sentence. However, his guilt in the events cannot be forgotten. When the police arrived to arrest him, Thomas stood up slowly. He didn't stand up for himself and didn't look around. She walked respectfully, with her head held high, even though her thoughts were full of different emotions. As the boy left the room, the low conversations began to return. Thomas listened to the low conversations and murmurs. He listened to the discussions on the subject. Did you know that many people thought he was guilty? They had been convinced by Michael's story and Anthony's false testimony. In the first few days, while trying to understand Anthony's betrayal and Michael's plan, Thomas got his head around it. The memories of that trial were still vivid in his head. He felt sad when he saw Anthony speak out against him. The lies changed what happened that night. He also noticed a look of hidden happiness on Michael's face. His first step was to call his CIA friends. Even though he was in prison, Thomas still had loyal friends. These friends knew him well, knew that he was an honest person, and trusted what he said. Thomas didn't get to speak directly to people on the outside very often, but every time one of his friends visited him, he was able to make progress. The investigation was careful and smooth. It was like a slowly closing net. The first hint came in the form of messages exchanged between Michael and Anthony. CIA agents managed to find conversations between the two. These conversations were made on a secure messaging app. However, intelligence was able to understand what was written. The messages showed Michael's true intentions and how he had managed to control Anthony. The messages were direct and showed guilt. Michael, in one of the conversations, told Anthony that he had to do what was necessary to make sure that Thomas was punished. The promise of $290,000 was clear, but it was also hidden. Michael's words were cold and sharp. They removed any doubt about his guilt. As the evidence mounted, Thomas continued to make plans. He knew that each new piece of evidence would bring him closer to justice. In a new meeting with his CIA friends, he obtained data on strange bank actions. The payment was made to Anthony indirectly. This happened through an account in a place where taxes are low, called a tax haven. The transfer of $290,000 was there, camouflaged among other transactions, but it could be followed closely by alert intelligence agents. Thomas heard about the discovery and felt for the first time that the pressure of prison was wearing off. This was more than a simple victory. It was a demonstration that the truth was coming out. Michael, who thought that his power would keep him safe, now had a weak spot uncovered. Anthony, who had given in to the desire to make money, would also be found out. Thomas knew that the new meeting, which was coming up soon, would be the time to tell him everything. With the new hearing date set, Thomas got the final and most important confirmation. All the evidence was organized and ready to be shown to the court. The records of the conversations between Michael and Anthony showed that they were communicating. The bank transfers were strange. In addition, anonymous witnesses said they had seen Michael and Anthony meeting secretly. Thomas knew that, with this evidence, it would be very difficult for Michael to escape punishment. The day of the new hearing arrived and the atmosphere was full of tension. The courtroom, illuminated by the bright morning light, was packed. There were people in every seat, including curious onlookers, lawyers, and reporters. They were eager to see the end of the case that had caused such a stir. Michael was sitting next to his lawyer. He looked very nervous. What had once been a proud confidence had now turned into a nervous, worried face. He felt that the situation was slowly getting worse. Rumors about the CIA's secret investigation began to spread. Anthony, on the other hand, was sitting very quietly, her body curled up on one of the benches in the courtroom. The fear on her face was clear. He was aware that his betrayal was going to be discovered by everyone. The guilt was already putting him under a lot of pressure. Thomas's lawyer stood up. He held a large dossier in his hands. He began to speak confidently and clearly. He was direct and didn't beat around the bush. He explained that new data had been obtained. This evidence will change the path of the trial. Everyone in the room was paying attention. The silence was total. All right, gentlemen, today we are going to show clear evidence that shows not only that Thomas is innocent, but also that Michael and his partner Anthony hatched a plan to unfairly put the blame on him, began the lawyer with an assurance that could be felt throughout the room. With a careful movement, he showed the first pieces of evidence, a sequence of messages that were sent between Michael and Anthony. The messages were the link that Thomas and his CIA friends had found and understood. The lawyer began to read the messages aloud. As Michael's words were shown, everyone realized that the plan to blame Thomas was well thought out. You have to do this. We both know he doesn't deserve to stay where he is. $290,000, Anthony. This is your chance to change your life. The lawyer's voice echoed around the room as he read the strongest message. The bribe, which had previously been just gossip, was now there, documented and beyond doubt. Thomas looked closely at how Michael reacted. Michael's shoulders were now bowed as if he were carrying the weight of the entire room. The confidence he had shown before was disappearing because of the evidence that was appearing. Michael tried to look serious, but it was obvious that he was losing control. Thomas's lawyer continued. He showed the second piece of evidence, the bank transactions. The financial documents that the CIA obtained clearly showed that $290,000 were sent to Anthony's account. This money came from an account abroad that is controlled by people who work for Michael. The whole room was quiet as they presented the details. They talked about the amounts, the dates, and also the names of the people who were involved in the transactions. The network of corruption was visible to everyone. There is no doubt that Mr. Michael, as a police officer, used his job to deceive and influence witnesses to lie about Thomas. The bribe really happened and the intentions were bad. The lawyer said this while showing the financial documents to everyone. The response in the room was immediate. Anxious whispers began to fill the room. The judge, with a serious look on his face, looked at Michael. He seemed to be waiting for an explanation that he knew wasn't going to happen. Michael's plan was very carefully and completely undone. He was at a dead end. Anthony, who had been quiet until now, could no longer bear the pressure of the situation. He suddenly stood up from the bench. This stopped the audience. Her eyes were full of tears and sadness. Her voice was hard to get out when she finally said, I told a lie. I lied about everything," shouted Anthony as his voice interrupted the heavy silence. "I took the money. I was unfaithful to Thomas." The words came out of her like an agonizing admission. Her hands were shaking and her body seemed about to fall over. The judge, after listening to the confession and looking at the evidence, had no option but to close the case definitively. The decision had already been made. Thomas was standing next to his lawyer. He looked at the judge and felt a mixture of relief and happiness. He had been cleared of all claims. His innocence had returned. The truth, which had long been hidden by lies and manipulation, had now won. The judge read out the decision coldly without showing any feeling. "Michael, you have been punished with 8 years in prison for your crimes. The crimes are racism, falsifying evidence, and abuse of power. Your attitude is a problem for justice and for the reputation of the police. Let this sentence show that no one is above the law," said the judge, his voice carrying across the room. Michael had no reaction. He knew there was no way he could escape. On the other side, Anthony was clearly very sad. The confession he had made a few minutes earlier was still hanging in the air like a puff of smoke. The judge looked at Anthony and paused for a moment. Anthony Santoro, you lied here in court and accepted money to make a false accusation against a man who is innocent. Even with your request for forgiveness and your confession, the judge thinks that your betrayal has caused serious problems. That's why you're going to prison for 3 years. May this sentence serve to remind you of the cost of dishonesty, said the judge with a serious manner, but also with a little compassion. Thomas, who had been quiet until that moment, looked at the 2 men who had tried to finish him off. As he looked at Anthony, he felt a pang of sadness. It was a story that could have been different. They had grown up side by side. They dreamed together of escaping poverty and having a better life. Anthony's decisions led him down a bad path. Now the friendship he once had has become a burden that is very hard to bear. The CIA chief, who speaks little, took to the stage to make the official announcement. His voice was calm, but it carried the burden of responsibility and respect for the man who was about to be honored. Thomas, today we celebrate not only your career, but also your bravery as a person. You went through a difficult time full of lies, disloyalty, and secret plans. In the end, the truth won out. This agency has complete confidence in you. This is not only because of your excellent skills as an agent, but also because of your strong honesty. With great pride, we have promoted you to be the national head of the CIA, said the director, as everyone in the room began to applaud. Thomas approached the podium. People were applauding a lot. Even so, he felt calm. Thank you all for your trust and support, he began, his voice resonating in the room. My path here has had many challenges, but each one has shown me what is really important: to seek the truth and to be faithful to those who believe in us. As the leader of this agency, I promise that honesty will always be our guide. No one here should accept injustice, even if the path is complicated. The applause returned with more force this time as Thomas left the podium. He wasn't just a man who had won a personal fight. He was now a leader who represented the force of truth and justice.